let's move on. A public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s has heard that those affected have lived through the worst of times. Final evidence has been given today. An estimated 30,000 people were infected with HIV and hepatitis C in what's been described as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. The counsel to the inquiry, Jenny Richards, KC, thanked every victim for coming forward.
The unimaginable pain and suffering endured by those infected, the lack of support, psychological and practical, and the lack of explanation, accountability and apology. All that is in the accounts that you have given the inquiry over the years.
Richard Wawick is with me tonight, one of 32 surviving pupils taking legal action. Hello, Richard.
Good evening, Stephen.
Good evening. Surviving pupils from Treelor. What age were you, Richard, when you... Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was 10 when I first went down there in 1976.
And Richard, what age were you when you realised that this had happened to you and you started to get angry about it?
Wow, well, there were three events at the college. I was first infected with hepatitis B at about 11 to 12 years old, and then HIV at the age of 16, and then later with hepatitis C. I didn't really have time to be angry about anything. To start off with, we didn't really know what was happening. The products that were being given at Treelor College, we thought were to help with the aiding of our hemophilia, to help our blood clot. And we didn't really look into it as children. We just thought they were trying to do the best thing by giving us the best treatment that they had at the college.
And when did it start to go wrong for you?
Really, the boys down there with all the blood tests we were having on a regular basis were certainly suspicious that something wasn't quite right. And it wasn't really until we left Treelor. The boys were dying, and we think we lost a couple at the school, and most died before they were 20, or at least into the middle 20s. And it was then really that we realised that something was desperately wrong with the treatment that we were being given. So it was very difficult for ourselves and our parents.
And how do you process it in your head that you've been so unlucky that you're one of a relatively few amount of people, obviously given our population, but it doesn't matter about that statistic. If it's happened to you, then your life's affected forever. How do you process that?
I think you've just got. In my case, I have a strong outlook on life. We lost 74 boys at the school. Lost loads of school friends. And to say, well, I'm only one of 30 or so that are still alive that we know of.
You feel lucky to be alive?
Yes, lucky. Yeah. There's a lot of survivor's guilt, obviously. You constantly ask yourself, why am I still here? I think that's with all of us that are still around all these years later. But it's been very, very difficult. The inquiry's helped a lot these last 4.5 years. We've met such wonderful people, far shyer, if you like, than I am. People have never even spoken to the families about the conditions, and it's been incredible. And I gave evidence in 2019. I wasn't going to do. I wanted to remain anonymous. And
why?
Why did I want to remain anonymous?
Yeah.
Fear of being found
Fear
out.
of what?
Well, the stigma around HIV and hepatitis. It's still prevalent today. I can assure you of that. So
it's not right, man. It's not right that you're fearful of being yourself or thinking that you need to be hiding?
Yeah, well, we actually bought just after we got married, we bought a small bungalow with a reasonably small mortgage, but we wanted it out of the way. So we bought somewhere out in the country, and just to get away from everyone. But at the inquiry, this is the interesting bit. I was going to be anonymous at the inquiry, and at the very last minute, I changed my mind, and I said to my wife, "We can do this together, We can give evidence together." And it was the most. I was as nervous as hell, but it was the most cathartic thing I think I've ever done in my life. It was a huge weight had been lifted off not only my shoulders.
It was brave, Richard, wasn't it? Given how you'd been feeling, it was a jump in the dark for you, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was a big risk as we saw it at the time. But I think it was the best thing I've ever done for both of us. And the thing about Trelaws particularly is that it was a boarding school for disabled children, physically disabled children. And the boys there, the haemophiliac boys there, were boarders. So it was an ideal place for tests to be done using different products on the boys, because they could be monitored around the clock. The blood's taken twice a day. And that's what happened. They employed research fellows. Not the NHS units at the school didn't employ them. The college employed them. Research fellows specifically to research the boys and try out different treatments on them to see. They called them infectivity trials. Okay, I mean that should say it all. So they tested different products from different manufacturers, Factor 8, mostly imported from the USA, on the children, tested the blood, seeing if there were any changes, and if not, monitor them, give them something else, test them, monitor the blood. And throughout that process, out of the 120 or so boys that were there, over 90 were infected, and 74 died. You have to remember that this was in the middle of the AIDS crisis, of course, in the mid-80s, mainly. So I think we're desperate to find something. I don't know what they're doing. We were referred to as being cheaper than chimps, which came out.
What? That's my goodness.
Yeah, and if you just Google cheaper than chimps haemophiliacs, being the letter, the Oxford haemophilia letter. So, it's been tough. It really has been difficult. But
and tell me this: do you think you would have led a completely different life? Do you think you would? What am I trying to ask? I'm trying to ask you: do you think you would have a completely different outlook in life? Do you think you would have a different personality if you hadn't been through this? It's got to have affected nearly your soul. This.
Yeah, possibly, very likely. I had lots of aspirations as a youngster, I think like all of us did. But unfortunately we were stopped in our tracks, and I've spent my whole life campaigning and pushing for this inquiry, the best part of 30 years of it. And to be honest with you, Stephen, it's going to leave, once this inquiry is over, no matter the outcome, it's going to leave a huge hole, a huge void in my life, because it's all I've done for the past 30 years. So on the one hand, you have the finality of the inquiry and whatever that may bring, and on the other hand, you lose friends, you lose touch with friends, and you lose touch with campaigners. So it's a double-edged sword.
Let me bring in Clive Smith tonight, who's been listening to you, Richard. Clive is chair of the Hemophilia Society. Good evening, Clive.
Good evening. Hello.
It's cruel. That's the word I'm minded to use when you hear Richard's story. The taking away of his dreams, of his aspiration, and that horrible, horrible term that he shared a matter of moments ago, that people looked upon them as cheaper than chimps. Like, it's horrible, Clive.
It is, and you've used the word cruel, but I hope you don't mind me mentioning before, you mentioned earlier that Richard had been unlucky, and in fact that was a phrase or a word that was used by the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, and in fact Richard wasn't unlucky in the sense that much of what happened was avoidable. The Health Secretary back in the mid-1970s, Lord Owen, said that we should become self-sufficient in relation to the production of blood products. And if we didn't, that was only going to affect a certain category of people, particularly people with bleeding disorders and haemophilia, like Richard. And so it wasn't unlucky in the sense that there was a perfectly identifiable class of people who were going to be impacted by this. And it's not just been cruel in terms of the infection, but it's been cruel in terms of the government response, or indeed the failure of the government to respond for decades. Richard's described his 30 years of campaigning and the hole that will leave in his life. And it's one thing to do harm to people, but it's another thing to deny what you've done, to obfuscate, to avoid. And that's sadly where we are today, and why so many people have had to fight for decades to get justice.
But justice has been done eventually.
Not yet. Not yet. The inquiry hasn't reported yet. We don't know exactly what the inquiry is going to say. The government itself has commissioned its own compensation study. The government has failed largely to respond to its own compensation study. And so justice hasn't been done. Justice has been denied to thousands of people. There are over 3,000 people with bleeding disorders who have died as a result of contaminated blood.
But you're on the brink now. People know the story. They know the facts, Clive. Okay,
they do, but we need a government response. And in the same week that we hear Bishop James Jones, who wrote a report about the experience of the Hillsborough family and the fact that it's taken government 5 years to respond to that, this community has very little confidence in government responding appropriately to this inquiry, which is part of the reason, I believe, why Sir Brian Langstaff, the chair today, said that he intends to issue an interim recommendation before Easter in relation to compensation, because despite the government having had the report since early last year, they've still not responded to it, and it's only because the chair of the inquiry is forcing the government to act that they are doing anything.
Sue Gorman, listening to this. Hello, Sue.
Hello.
You lost your husband, Steve Diamond, December 2018, liver failure caused by sclerosis linked to hepatitis C.
Caused by hepatitis C, caused by contaminated blood products. And it's very rare for that to actually be on a death certificate. And I think it's very important that such an attempt was made to cover up what was happening, that people's death certificates were incomplete. And it's one of the things we hope will come out of the inquiry, is the right to have the death certificate either corrected or in the future for them to actually say what caused it. Because I know one thing, when my husband realised that he'd lost his battle, one thing that mattered to him was that the correct cause of his death was actually recorded. So that's actually been something that other people have said to me that they wish that they had happened to them. So it's one of the recommendations to the chairman that is somehow made possible.
Tell me more about your husband and when he realised he had been affected by this.
Well, my husband didn't realise he'd been infected by it until 21 years after the actual infection. And the difference between my husband and Richard and Clive is that my husband was a mild haemophiliac. And so he didn't actually need any of the treatments he had. And in fact, he lost his life for 2 bruises. He went along to say, do I need to do something about it? And instead of them saying, wait for a couple of days and see what happens, or using one of the other possible treatments that weren't implicated in the contamination, they just jabbed him with the latest new wonder drug from the States. And he was infected in 76, and he wasn't told until 97. And so, yes, it wrecked his life, because he had plans of a university career. Within a year, he was infected the last year at university. He lost his ability to concentrate, so he lost his chance of pursuing a research degree. And he kept running out of energy. He suffered brain fog. He was confused.
Okay.
And he was made to feel diminished. And if they had if he'd given him a diagnosis, it's one thing that they did it in the first place, which was wrong. But if they'd given him a diagnosis in a timely manner, he could have been spared an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of feelings of inadequacy. But they were so busy hiding behind what they did that they didn't actually care that the emotional destruction they were causing to the victims, but also to the families. You know, if you know somebody is ill and you live with them behaving oddly, you know it's because they're ill. You take one view. If somebody's behaving oddly for no good reason, you take a different view. And it just made life very difficult for the affected community, the people who live with them.
It affected relationships. It affected how you looked upon the person you loved.
Absolutely. And a number of marriages suffered. A number of children ended up having very bad relationships with their father because they couldn't understand. And because of the stigma that was being described to you, parents didn't always tell their children. So the child didn't actually know why daddy was behaving like that.
Are you left with a degree of guilt? Like it's not logical, is it? Because it wasn't your fault. But
absolutely.
Are you left with a degree of guilt that you somehow, didn't understand enough because you didn't have all the information?
Oh, massively. But the awful thing in life was that once I knew what was wrong with Steve, why he behaved like he did, for me, the slate was wiped clean, if you like. He never forgave himself. And I say to him, it's all right, you couldn't help it. And he said, it isn't all right because of what I put you through. And he suffered with that for the rest of his life. But yes, a terrific guilt after he died because he was so scared of the treatments because he'd heard that there were things in the treatments. And he only went to the doctor to reassure me because the bruise was so bad. I'd never seen anything like it. And yes, huge guilt that I let it happen. Huge guilt that I wasn't more patient, that I wasn't more understanding. Huge guilt that I nearly left him. And I've had, people have said to me, you behaved like a normal human being. It wasn't your fault either. You shouldn't blame yourself. But the truth is that what the scandal has done has actually sort of chucked us into a parallel universe where the normal rules of life don't apply.
What needs to happen now, Sue?
What needs to happen now is the government need to finally stand up and admit that something very serious went wrong, something avoidable went wrong, and that that they were also totally out of order in the way they treated us in the 40 years since the infection started. That the government needs to stop finding reasons not to pay compensation, because what we're asking for is not a financial windfall. It's the financial security we should have had from our own earnings. I mean, not only were people like Steve or like Richard actually deprived of the means of providing for themselves, for their wives, from having children, they were actually made to feel failures, feel like scroungers because of nothing they did wrong. And that needs to be righted in a prompt payment of compensation without regard to the national debt, because if they had paid it when it was first due, the country wouldn't have been in the same economic mess it is now. And they need to sort of dissociate the two things.
Do you think they will?
No, quite honestly. I think they will. Well, I think they will pay something, but I think they will make it as miserable as possible because that's what they always do. There's no signs that they are. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say what's been really helpful for me tonight, listening to all of you, is that every time I looked at this story, I kept on thinking of the physical consequences that your loved ones went through. But when I start to hear your story of how relationships are damaged, you said you nearly left your husband, for goodness sake, and all of that, it brings it on to a completely different level for me. So thank you for talking to me, and to you, Richard. Thank you very much, and to you, Clive. Thank you.